Welcome to the Insightful Investor Podcast, a weekly series that seeks to share industry, investment, and market insights. Learn more about our show at insightfulinvestor.org. We have a very special guest today. David Rutherford is a former Navy SEAL, a SEAL instructor, and a CIA contractor. David is now an award-winning podcast host, highly respected performance coach, and the founder of the Froglogic Institute, which offers programs to help individuals and teams overcome adversity, embrace fear, build self-confidence, and develop a strong sense of purpose. We're going to dive into deep into all these topics and explore how investors can draw valuable lessons from David's unique experience and insights. He also serves as a trainer with First Trust, which is how we became acquainted. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Alex. It's a privilege to be with you.
Let's go back to your early SEAL days. What inspired you to become a Navy SEAL and eventually an instructor?
My story, I think, is common amongst young men that was kind of disenfranchised with what had taken place collegiately for myself. I'd always dreamed to play D1 football. That didn't happen. I ended up, playing D1 lacrosse with some, grand illusion that I was going to be able to walk on a football team where I was, at Penn State where I was playing. And it just wasn't in the cards for me. I wasn't dialed in with what my performance thresholds actually were. I'd created this, long running illusion that I had all the attributes to play at that highest level. And it just wasn't true. And so I didn't handle that. I didn't have any substantial foundation of how to pull myself out of that kind of strong sense of fear and failure. And it was just through a random, not random, but a guy who lived next door to me my freshman year. This guy, Tony Gronsky, who from Scranton, PA, who was in the Army Reserves. And he had given me a book about SEALs my freshman year, read it cover to cover. And then in my, my fourth year, I really was in a pretty substantial quagmire of not only emotional instability, but also of ambition. And when I sat down and kind of made the decision, what am I going to do with my life? The Navy SEALs came to the forefront of my consciousness. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll join the Navy, be a Navy SEAL, and everything will be just fine. So that was the pretense of the decision.
Is there anything you can share about the training regimen at the SEAL at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been so many incredible books written about it. There's so many programs that outline it. There's a lot of documentaries, but I think, the biggest thing is the level with which you've got to be prepared to be measured. We live in a world today where, I think there's a strong group of the population that is trying to reduce that type of meritocracy. And for us, that's the key. And I think for all organizations, businesses, teams, the greater the ability to articulate measurement, the better the program for development can be. And I think, ours has been in development for 80 plus years. I mean, that's really the magic behind it. A lot of people don't realize, our program, I mean, from when I first showed up in November 1995 to where I left the teams in June of '03, there were people doing research on the program and conducting research. And we were asking different people to help us, cultivate and develop and enhance and reassess. And I mean, it's just one of those, the deeper I think an organization can go into the metrics of training in an applicable way, right? Not just nonsensical measuring, which, can demolish the psyche, but really integrated ideas behind what the training hopes to achieve, the objectives, and then the metrics by which the individual is evaluated. When those are really connected and really symbiotic, then what it can produce is pretty remarkable.
What do you think it takes to succeed as a SEAL? And I ask that because I assume everyone is physically fit. So is the mental strength that separates the ones who survive?
What really leapt out to me was it's more about pain management than anything. There was a time in probably 2013, 14, where I spent about 2 years really trying to understand fear and how it controls us. When you look at the formula behind creating a SEAL, creating a Green Beret, creating a MARSOC Marine, an AVSOC guy, it's about the application of pain. And for me, it was really the difference between the individual that can recalibrate that pain so it's positive versus a consistent and perpetual presence of negative pain. And it's really that's where the psychology comes in. How do I flip this around and recognize that the more focused pain I can apply or I can allow being applied, the greater sense of humility opens you up to a more rapid assimilation of the information, right? And that's the key is because so within all of us, there's this resistance, and the resistance is, pain, the interpretation of pain that mixes with fear. Fear, triggers a lack of self-confidence, and then the unwillingness to assimilate into the overall team structure, which delivers purpose. So yeah, I think you still have to be willing to run the miles and dive the dives and swim the swim and get up when your knees are swollen and your back is killing you and you're bleeding from your pits and your neck because you spent the previous day like 10 hours covered in sand all over your body. So you know you still have there is a physicality, but it's about the switch upstairs for sure.
Well, you've developed deep expertise in some of the topics you've alluded to: fear, resilience, teamwork, self confidence, purpose, adaptability. As you went through that experience as a Navy SEAL. Today, what I'd like to do is explore how these powerful concepts translate to investing, business, and broader life performance. Let's start with one of the most powerful forces we all face. You talked about it, is fear. Did you feel fear is hardwired in us, or can it be managed so it doesn't paralyze us or lead to poor decisions?
That's the ultimate question. It took me a while. When I was developing the Froglogic concepts, it all originated with self confidence because that would seem to be the thing in buds every day that I had to rehabilitate. Because, you might have the best day in the world, and then the next day you do everything wrong, and the instructors are screaming and hammering. You're like, what happened? I thought I was dialed in, and then just like that it's over and flipped, and now you have to rehabilitate that. So that's where I started. And then when I finally left working for the agency after 4 years, in 2011 was my last year I was deploying. And then in 2012, when I first started professionally speaking at a corporate level, was in the financial services industry, and the number one question I would get was, were you afraid? And I used to answer with kind of these snapperhead responses because it's such an intimate question, right? Someone's asking you, were you afraid? And I think if you're from our generation, you were kind of conditioned where, you don't expose those weaknesses per se. But as the time went on, I began to realize that that was one of the most consistent questions. And so I wanted to understand. And so I spent about 2 years really trying to understand fear. And yes, we are hardwired for it. There's no doubt. Our limbic system pretty much works around fear. I mean, there's an argument that it also has a major contribution towards, the other joy and a sense of elation and those types of emotions as well too. But I think the governing aspect of our limbic system is how we process that which we are afraid of. And yeah, so when you look at, just the nature of stress hormones, and you look at the way your amygdalic response triggers, you look at the way your hippocampus works and your medulla, and, all these really core natural indicators that provoke fear. And then you've got, the hardwire for, I mean, a couple years ago, some really bright gentlemen out of MIT discovered that there's a dedicated circuit in your brain for snakes, right? And so, out of the, 80 to 90 billion neurons you have, and if one's dedicated, man, there's a reason why. And so you have to think about that natural anthropological challenge that we faced when, we weren't tribal in nature, or we were just kind of nomadic and following our food, what was going to kill you. And that was everything. So it sharpened our vision, it sharpened our taste, it sharpened our reflexes. And so, yeah, it's undoubtable that, we are certainly wired. And then the other one is, we're, I think, the very nature of society, and it's not just Western society. I think it's even more provocative over in societies that are third world, because you live with fear every single day, whether it's political instability, economic instability, or tribal instability. I think that fear is a profound sense of governance for most anybody that's going to try and influence someone else and give them the best lessons learned. Those lessons are usually a derivative of traumatic experience. And so we're taught fear our whole lives as well too. And in fact, that's what you do for a living, is you help manage fear on a regular basis. And I'd say over the last year, I think I was in front of somewhere around 4,200 advisors, 30 different states. And, the overwhelming consensus was people were afraid. The volatility of our political endeavors, the volatility of the social structures of our country, and then, just the kinetic nature of the markets right now are just, I think, always causing that fear to be triggered in a way that it requires a very dedicated way to manage that. So yeah, we're wired for it. We're taught it. And it's probably, out of the 8 core emotions, I believe it's the most substantial one that you have to learn how to, you can't defeat fear. There's no such thing as fearless. I mean, I've found a couple studies. The most common one I use is the movie Solo, the Alex Honnold story, where he free soloed Half Dome, and there's this great scene in the movie. For me, it was small, but it was relevant, where he had fallen off the face, and he goes in, he gets a CAT scan, and what they realize is that there's very reduced blood flow to his amygdalas. And what they believe is, and they touched on it just briefly, he said, well, my mother was on the scale and never once told me she loved me. She didn't give me physical affection. And then my dad had Asperger's, and he did the same, never gave me hugs, never gave me anything. And so, that's what the theory was, I think, in his mind, was that was the auspice behind his desire to put himself in that space where fear is so substantially palpable that he feels something. Right. And so, that's one anecdote, but I've read enough, seen enough, and instructed people enough in high risk training evolutions to recognize it is a substantial aspect of whether or not we succeed or not.
From an investor standpoint, I feel like it's an investor's constant companion.
Absolutely.
There's not only fear of loss and fear of the unknown, but there's also fear of missing out on the upside. So I feel like it's always there.
Well, we saw it recently with the whole tariff thing, right? I mean, I remember I was out in Colorado with some wholesalers, and the markets were plummeting and everybody's freaking out. And I had just done a show recently with Bryce Gill, one of our economists, and was like, hey, listen, yeah, the economy's strong, we're strong, onshoring's coming back, which is, there's a $7 trillion commitment from overseas investment. And the idea of regenerating a strong industrialized nation, I mean, that could be revolutionary for our country. And so, a little bit of pain now for long-term gain is substantial. But again, when you're talking about people's life savings, their hard work, their blood, their sweat, and their literal tears, that's a very emotional thing. And it generates a lot of fear when you see your net worth drop 45, 46% overnight. you know, it's troubling for people.
Well, what is your process for embracing fear? And what key steps do you recommend for turning fear into a tool for better decision making, as you alluded to earlier?
Fear is an interesting one, because it does take a process. First and foremost, when I developed Froglogic, now it's a very sequential program. I believe one thing has to happen to get to another, to get to another, to get to another. And so that sequence is, first, you learn to embrace your fear. Then once you got your fear a little dialed in, then you have to perpetually learn how to rehabilitate your self confidence. So it's forging that confidence to be able to take the beating every day. Then once your self confidence is dialed in, now you're ready to pick the right team to be a part of, because nobody does it alone. And you have to dial in your team orientation, how that works. And then once you're on the right team, that's where your purpose will emerge. When you have that collective mission in mind and you're going after that ambition that's in you. So, fear is a 5-step process. First and foremost, you have to search for the truth of your fear. You have to really become to understand it. And like step one of this is, and I give these, these seminars on it. And step one is, write down everything you've ever been afraid of when you were a kid, now and in the future. And I asked this question, how many people in the room have done this? And I think I've given this talk, 4 times in the last 2 months, and out of the 8 talks I give. And, every single time, there's not a single person in the room to raise their hand. But yet everybody's highly educated, everybody's successful, everybody manages fear every day with their clients, but they just have not done this exercise. What's fascinating to me is the fact that the industry is so analytical. And Jim Bowen always loves to say the math doesn't lie, right? And so what's the math of your fear? And I think people just don't spend a lot of time. So first discover what you're actually afraid of, how it presents itself, how it affects you, all those ideas. And then the one that really I think is pivotal is you go to the people that are really you're closest to, and you describe some of this behavior and say, hey, do you see this in me? And when you see this in me, how do I act? How do you deal with it? And they will give you, if you ask them those, those hard hitting questions, if they truly love you, they will give you the honest answers. And that sort of solidifies it for people, saying, wow, this is something that is very much present in my life. And I think for everybody, the level of control is a little bit different, but I think it's there and it's seen. And then when someone confirms it for you, that makes it real. The second part of this is to accept the reality of your fear. And that's really to get to a little scientific on it, to recognize, I have people go investigate. First and foremost, it's like, hey, just recognize that it's not new, right? Human beings have essentially been experiencing some form of your fear forever, right? For as long as we've had consciousness, right? That first revelatory awakening within that first human being, to say, oh, wow, I'm conscious. And then your self consciousness emerges, and then you're afraid, right? What's going to kill me? I think, that aspect of recognizing you're not alone in your fear. Go read the DSM-5. You'll see some of these other things. There's a million websites that do personality tests or analysis. And obviously, they all have, I think, some positive attributes in them. But the biggest thing is to really do the work individually, right? To evaluate yourself in a some type of measured process where you can get down to the understanding that this is how I operate, this is how I do. And then what it becomes is like, all right, what is going to be the purpose, the exact purpose within my fear? What aspect of my fear specifically am I going to address? Right. And then the third aspect is to retrain your brain. Now, a lot of people are like, well, what the hell does that mean? How do I retrain my brain? Well, you
Especially if you're
have
hardwired, right?
100%. But what people don't understand, what they don't recognize is the massive influence for the different types of cultural influence that we've been susceptible to, right? From 2 to 10, you're indoctrinated into this anthropological culture, which is how your family's great 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 grandfather was raised, and what he passed down and what he passed down. And now we understand that's a lot of that. The aspects of that genetic makeup is down on the molecular level, right? It's integrated into our DNA. And so how that's the real hardwiring. But then, starting at a very early age, we're introduced to these sociological ideas as well, too. All the different teams you're on, the different schools you go to, the different classes you're in, all of those little sociological imprints make a difference too. And depending upon what types of groups that you allow yourself to be, you know, collectively programmed in, can also be a very distinguished kind of mapping system for what your fear is going to look like. And so, all right, how do we begin to retrain our brains? And for me, the ultimate retraining came in Hell Week. When you look at the sheer just data on Hell Week, and human beings shouldn't do this, right? It's not healthy to stay up for 96 straight hours while you're getting pummeled by a 300-pound boat on your head and freezing cold water for extended periods of time. I mean, just in that week alone, we run somewhere around 200 miles, right? And, we're burning 6 to 9,000 calories a day. The rough estimates is it takes somewhere between 3 and 5 years off your life, right? And so you're going to go into that's the impact on it. And now, but what happens is all of your pre existing self-imposed limitations that are a derivative of those two types of influence, the anthropological and the sociological influences culturally, those essentially either get pressed pause or people can really rewrite their coding in that week. And then out of that, now all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, there's nothing I can't do. There's nothing I can't endure, right? There's no level of pain that's going to impede on my ability to achieve that which I desire most, that ambition, right? So, I think then it's retrain your brain. Then you got to test yourself. Testing is something that people post maybe college and maybe some testing that exists within, climbing the corporate ladder, I think, or whatever. But it's very de minimis, right? Which is bizarre to me. We spend so much of our youth being tested over and over and over, and then all of a sudden it just ends and ends in a way that it really is detrimental to, I think, the continued development, psychological development of the individual, especially on an operational level. And that's why I just really, one of the things I always stress when I work with teams is like, all right, what's your training regimen look like? What are the metrics that you're going to measure output or production with? How about how you test whether or not your people are doing the to really genuinely represent the culture that you've established when they onboard a new client or when they're recruiting a new client or when they profile a new client. Like, what do those metrics look like? And that's a real problem because I think the older we get, the less we actually want to be tested. And why? Is because our pride emerges at a pretty substantial level once we attain a certain level of success. So, test yourself, and that really helps it helps determine of whether or not the training that you're conducting to embrace your fear is working. Because, there's a great concept out there. It's called stress inoculation. And what we need to do is when we learn something, we have to place it under stress. We call it, placing yourself on the anvil of life, right? Where you're going to apply that pressure and that heat and see whether or not, when you take that blade off and you put it into and how do you pull it out of the fire and you use it? Is it going to break? Is it going to chip? Is it going to shatter? And that's what testing does for us. And then the final one is to live with the courage, knowing that fear is inescapable, that pretty much every significant decision in your life, you're going to be confronted by this idea of fear. Not idea, but it's a feeling. It's a deep, deep feeling of fear. And do you possess the tools to really, stand up for what you believe in and push yourself forward, right?
As you talk through that, the part that really struck me, and I understand why it's step one, is to recognize that fear is there and you can't just ignore it. One thing that I've noticed is there are some people, and what immediately comes to mind are elite athletes like Michael Jordan or Tom Brady or even Mookie Betts, who I know you've worked with. When they're in a very stressful period and it's crunch time, they thrive. Whereas a lot of others, they tighten up during those difficult periods. And I've heard you talk about this notion of restructuring our perspective of pain. Would you talk through that as it relates to high stress situations?
Absolutely. When COVID hit, my business collapsed and I pretty much lost everything. I think it was like 15 events I was scheduled to do, speaking events. I was supposed to work with the Minnesota Twins that year. I lost out on that. I was supposed to work with a Fortune 50 company to completely restructure their training profile. My podcast was doing great. My social media was exploding, all this. And then COVID hit and it all went away. And, that was debilitating. And through, me being interested and I'd heard on Joe Rogan, I'd heard Dr. Jordan Peterson several times. I ended up discovering his old stuff, his original stuff that he was putting out. And he has this one show called Restructuring Your Perceptions Part Two. And the way he distilled down the sequencing of meaning based on action, effort, or your deeds hit me in such a profound level that I was like, whoa, that's exactly what we do in special operations, right? Every day you're going in, you're going to look at a particular evolution that you're going to engage in, whether it's jumping out of a perfectly good airplane or, putting on your breathing apparatus, your dragger, and you're going to go for a dive in some foreign harbor in the middle of the night and, have cargo ships run over your head. That's talked about fear. And so it's like, but what do? We restructure the fear in a place, well, oh, I've already jumped out of an airplane 50 times before, right? So I know what to expect. I know how to prepare. I know what I needed to do in training. Same thing with that dive, right? I might have already, you know, 400 hours underneath the water of combat diving. So as long as I have the right dive plan, my dive buddy's prepared, I'm in good shape. I know what I'm doing. I've done the map studies, all this, then going into it, what it is. And I think that's what I really saw with some of the really great athletes that I worked with, in particular Mookie, right? He was prepared and he didn't rest on, a lot of people will practice, they get it right, and then they move on. The elite performer, practices until they never get it wrong again. That effort is perpetual in nature, right? And so that preparation, I think, is really the defining characteristic. And so the more prepared you are, the more reps you've done, it enables you to take that fear and shrink it down to, what ultimately is the thing that gets most of us, which is the external response, right? That which is outside of our control. And then in that case, it's managing that. And I see so often high performers, that's the thing that just gets them. You've done the thousands and thousands and thousands an hour. And by the way, that whole Malcolm Gladwell, that's complete bogus bull. 10,000 hours is ridiculous. It's absolutely just a ridiculous number. I mean, there's guys at SEAL Team 6 or at Delta or at other tier one units, they've trained way over 10,000 hours, right? And just you'll ask them and they're like, I've shot 2 million rounds of ammunition and I'm just starting to get good. And that's the mentality, right? That's the restructuring your perception that somehow people get to a certain point over an aggregated time of feeling pain and the repetitions, and they like, oh, they have one larger success or one series of successes, and then they're like, oh, I'm good, man, I'm done. But the greats, it's learning to perform the basics as close to perfection as possible in perpetuity, right? And it's just going and going and going, and that way when your operational environment changes, it doesn't affect you. Like one of the most common things that I ask advisors out there is how long have you been in the business? So Alex, how long have you been in the business?
26 years.
Was it anything like it is today when you started?
There are some things that are timeless, but a lot changes.
And what are the things that are timeless?
Core principles like, it's important to be diversified. Markets are cyclical, they're volatile, there's a lot of unknowns. Those things are pretty timeless, and
Yep.
it's just a different day. But same principles often apply.
And those principles are derivative of how you express that to the relationships that matter most to you, right? And so what is the core idea behind your profession is the quality and competency of that relationship and the ability to deliver trust on a regular reoccurring basis. The person who trusts you is the person that will be able to rein in that fear, right? Alter their perception of, oh my God, the sky is falling, based on the rapport that you've spent years and years and years cultivating. Now, the modalities with which you deliver that safety, deliver that consistency evolve for sure, because markets are evolving and new products are evolving and different concepts and different levels of wealth and opportunities that present with that. So, but at its core, right, it's you, and it's all the different reps you've done, the thousands of phone calls you've logged, the different times and places in the volatility of those markets, how you see the specific reactions emotionally to those fluctuations, and you knowing specifically how to handle that client in that moment, in that environment. And that's elite right there.
The thing that strikes me with what you just talked about is a lot of it is confidence. So for the athlete, it's self confidence that comes from repeating that process. And when you're in a stressful environment, you have the confidence that you can fight through it, and that takes many hours and reps to do. The example that you just described is the clients having confidence in our approach, our strategy, et cetera, because they've seen it, time and time again.
The other really amazing attribute to high performers is that when they do fail, they don't allow the failure to dominate their focus, right? They fail, they learn immediately from it, they adapt the failure, whatever the incremental evaluation is, right? That little thing. Well, this is what specifically caused that failure. Okay, get rid of the rest. That's what now I integrate. I go back to train with that failure now integrated into my overall consciousness of the training profile. And then the next time I face it, oh, I know exactly what to do in this moment because I've already trained that out of me.
Yeah, and you know that you
Yeah.
just got a little bit better.
Yes. Well, you do, but again, here's the other thing. You only really know when you're on the battlefield, right? Like you can train and train and train and train, but the one thing, and that's why when people ask us, what's the real difference between special operations and everything else, is we train more than everybody else. We put ourselves in as many scenarios as humanly possible, prior to, the event. Like when you look at the Bin Laden raid, those guys at Damnick, they hit a mock facility that they had built at a secret base. They hit that thing, they practiced hitting it like 150 plus times, right? And it was so funny. One of the last ones, and a friend of mine that I had gone through Hell Week was, his name's Rob O'Neill. And Rob was one of the team leaders of that. And he's like, all right, does anybody have any more ideas or what we need to do? And so one of the junior guy on the team was like, yeah, what if the helicopter crashes? So he's like, Roger, all right, we're going to practice the helicopter crashing. Well, what happened? The helicopter crashes. Now, any other time, an event like that could be catastrophic for the psyche of the team and the individuals. But because they had rehearsed it, because they had, at a minimum, restructured the perception of it to acknowledge it as a high possibility, when it happened, it was seamless what they did. And, they were able to conduct what I believe was one of the most successful operations in U.S. history because of the preparation, their professionalism, and the recognition that in the midst of the failure, they didn't allow the failure to distract them in real time. They adapted and moved on to what was the preliminary plan wasn't affected. And I think a lot of time under those extreme environments, under stress, under whatever, the unknown, when the unknown is kind of hammering, I call it the negative insurgency, right? But that external thing that's always looking to tear you away from your success. When that hits you, if you allow that emotional tsunami to overwhelm you, then you're essentially you're operationally ineffective, and now you have to get someone else to come in and backfill you.
You can think of that as the unknown enemy,
That's right.
risks that are off your radar. And I believe there are a lot of these risks in the world of investing, particularly today. Let me ask you something about mental toughness and resilience, as that's obviously important in the topics we've covered so far, but also in if you're running a business or you're trying to fight through a challenging market environment. Are there any frameworks that you use for making sound decisions in high stress or uncertain situations?
I did this little experiment with the never quit mindset where I went back. I used to have a real big podcast with Marcus Luttrell, the lone survivor. And for 3 years, we went on this really fun adventure of interviewing people from all walks of life, what their greatest never quit story was. And like we interviewed Secretary Perry. We interviewed Mark Wahlberg. We interviewed Lance Armstrong, Diana Nyad, who swam from Cuba to Florida at 64 years old. Just some unbelievable guests that we had on, and they told these remarkable stories. And then when COVID hit, that idea of the never quit mindset really kind of emerged, because people were pretty emotionally distraught. And many people had their livelihoods, including me, destroyed as a result of that. And so, I dug in and I went back and I reevaluated kind of all of those shows and tried to, segment them into these core ideas, which ended up emerging from not only those, but also my experience, in the teams and as an instructor in the various places I've taught. And what really kind of emerged was these core attributes. One was work ethic, right? People who seem to have a powerful work ethic when, the proverbial, excrement hits the fan, right? A lot of people will stop, but other people will dig in and work. One of the places I see it quite a bit is I see it when, people have a loved one die early or tragically. What do? They go back and they dig into work, right? And they work through it, right? That's what that whole thing comes from, just work through it. And I think that's a really interesting one. The other one is the idea of defiance, right? To defy that which you believe is trying to tear you down. It's kind of like the chip in your shoulder one. And define others, define concept. The big one was really when certain people who feel like they're undervalued, right? When someone tells you, you stink, you're never going to make it, you're never going to do it, you're never like, I mean, if I had $1 for everybody who told me there was no way I was going to make it through the SEAL training, I'd be a pretty wealthy man because of where I was coming from out of college. Like people couldn't believe it. They're like, you're going to do what? Never going to happen. And so that defiance thing.
That can drive you for certain people, right? Some people that tear you down, but for others, it can drive you.
That's right. And several, I've got several close friends that are really successful, and that's the thing that's their motivation every day, that defiance. The other one is kind of this aha moment, like it's this revelatory experience, kind of where you get to the bottom of that sensation of failure or fear, and you realize I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done. And you just change and then you allow that bottom sensation or, that awakening moment, that revelatory consciousness, right? That thing, that life altering experience or event. And then that just provokes profound focus and purpose in people's lives. And then they chase that purpose for a period of very strong focus during that. I call it the focused obsession. And then the final one is really this idea of it's like the love of your life. Like people have a real strong sense of gratitude where they come from. Their families inspire them deeply. They love what they do, right? Those people that you just like, whoa, that person is really full, right? Their cup is full and it's infectious. Like, man, I want some of what they got. And they just are able to structure that perception to realize that, life is imbued with suffering and pain and it's just part of it, but it's what's going to make me more appreciative and grateful and my desire when I sacrifice for others. And that was really the core in that people's willingness to sacrifice for others. So, I think within that never quit moment, those are some attributes that I really believe are profound.
Another big topic that you brought up earlier is teamwork, and I guess part of that is leadership. Obviously, you need this for business. You can think of a portfolio as having a team of components that each have a role to play in a diversified portfolio. But as a SEAL, you literally put your life in the hands of your team. What would you say makes a great team, and why is the team so critical for success?
Team is everything. I mean, it's the essence of all success within every human being, whether that success is Machiavellian or the success is divine in nature, right? Team orientation is the grand power behind all societies and civilizations and cultures. And so, like, how do you cultivate the team orientation at the highest level? I believe that there's a sequence that forms great culture, but once you're in, like, committed to that team, it's four things. It's a high level commitment, Mike Mansour, willing to die for his teammates, training, it's going through the program, no matter how hard or how long it takes. Right. And then once you have that training, that reinforces your ability to communicate at the highest level, that very honest, focused, direct approach to communication in those strong teams is a profoundly distinguishing characteristic. The greatest teams I've ever worked with are the teams that communicate in the most sincere and honest ways. And then finally, the leadership portion of that. And there's really four core ideas behind the leadership development. First and foremost, you've got to be willing to be cold, wet, and sandy with everybody with you. Now, in our training apparatus, that's legit. Our officers go through the same training as us, and many times they get even a greater beat down than we do. They take more heat because the responsibilities are greater. The other is a grander sense of situational awareness, right? I always see, what you always hear on big leaders is they try and you know, parse out the critical aspects that they need to focus on. Well, the reality is that if your junior man doesn't feel worthy, that you're interested in what they're doing, then that's going to really, really have an impact negatively on your organization. But the biggest one is those junior managers. The junior managers are the key to the success of every small business, big business, whatever. And if the investment in those people is not dialed in, that's where you start having really significant charge. So be situationally aware of the different levels of input and influence in your organization. That's huge. And then within those lower levels, if there's no concept that there's a responsibility within them to lead, right? And that's the way you look at the representation of your organization. Like you are a leader. You lead in the community, you lead around, like, and then you're training those people to become a leader, even if that means they go out and start their own business and say, hey, thank you so much. That's the ultimate thing because you've influenced them and given them enough of these ideas. And if you do it the right way, you pay them well, you give them the growth trajectory, you show them the path, they will become as loyal as anybody else. And then finally, as you talked before, Alex, the ability to analyze in the appropriate time what the actual battlefield looks like and then to take risks. And that's the number one thing that I see more often than not is leaders unwilling to take risks because, and most of that has to do with the lack of work they've done in developing their team. They just they don't trust their team. They don't trust that if I'm going to take this huge risk, expand into another city or state or whatever, if I don't believe in my team, then I'm not going to take that risk, right? And that's I think the biggest challenge is taking smart dialed in risk as a result of the strength of your team beneath you.
Yeah, and a lot of it is self-reinforcing, right?
That's right.
Meaning you have the reps, you have the training, you have the tests to make sure the training is working, and then you make the improvements and you do all that well, then you build confidence in yourself and your role as part of the team and confidence in the team itself.
That's
And
right.
then you're more likely to fight through painful experiences and I guess that reinforces that self-confidence. So let's talk about peak performance. What does it take to achieve peak performance? And how do science and psychology play a role? And which do you think is more important?
First and foremost, the skill set needs to be identified. What is the specific skill set that I want to be elite on, right? Now, obviously every single thing can be distilled down. And that's what we do, right? If I'm teaching, introduction to tactical pistol, right, there are 8 core fundamentals when you're static on a flat range facing a target, a paper target, right? These 8 core things. So each one of those 8 things need to be trained and replicated, iterated over, let's call it 500 to 1,000 rounds. Then once I see proficiency there, now I'll put in the next thing, which is basic movement, facing movement, face left, face right, right? Facing the other way, doing a full turnaround. Then I add in moving, walking left, walking right, right? And so what you're doing is you're stacking the things that are measurable, right? And that's the way that first and foremost you have to identify the skill set specifically, and then break out what are the things that can be measured in that experience. The other is the recognition of, now when you establish how you're going to train that, right? So often people want to put a finite timeline on that. Well, for everybody's going to train at a different rate. Now, what you can do is, the more dialed in your training regimen is, you can get a greater group of people up to speed faster, but they have to be willing to experience the pain at the higher level. What people need to understand is that most everybody, we call it the 40% rule. It was made famous by David Goggins' book he did with what's his name, Jesse Eisman, I think, where he spent 30 days with him. And every human being gives an input. Well, they have about 40% more to give, right? There's 40% more effort they can give. Now, if you're just getting 15% of a person's total capability, you're in a problem. And so really what it becomes down to is, how do you force that behavioral shift? And it's conditioning, right? It's the recognition. This is the standard. And this is the standard of the expectation of your organization. We expect you to be willing to at least give us this on this many times. But so often people don't lay that out as they're bringing people in. They don't establish it correctly in the right culture. And so that becomes a difficult aspect. All right. So now you've got people that are committed. They're willing to go the extra mile. They want to push themselves heavily against a particular skill set. Now it's like, all right, how do we know, establishing the correct training, and then giving them the opportunity in a real world environment to test that knowledge base, and then to do so over and over and over and over and over again. And I think that's where you can begin to really, really advance your organization. The hardest, though, like I said, is every human being has this variable of how they perceive pain, and then how hard they're willing to push themselves in order to not overcome it, but like we continuously say, to restructure their perception of it. So it's a motivational tool instead of an impediment.
And I suppose peak performance doesn't have a finish line. You can always get better.
100%.
Right. And so how important is embracing failure and learning from mistakes for continuous growth?
It's absolutely the most important aspect of training. If you're not built, like I see all these, continuing education things, and my old man was an attorney, and my God, if I don't, if I forget, like it seemed like every other quarter he was going to some estate planning conference in Orlando or Tallahassee or wherever it was, in order to keep his, credentials up to speed, or some tax thing or whatever. And it was always like, you show up and you sit there, click your boxes and you're done with it. Well, if this is your profession, is it enhancing you? Are you making yourself better? Are you really pushing yourself? And that becomes the real challenge, I think, for people, is that ability to push yourselves when you don't feel like pushing yourselves. And that's what peak performance is. It's to recognize that we have these plateaus in our lives. Well, the better you get, the plateaus aren't bigger; they're teeny. They're like, oh, I improved by one half measurement of a metric that I used to measure against this particular skill set, and to be good with that. And that's really what it becomes. It's those small, like minuscule little pieces that you begin to sharpen the edge with, with the more dedication you have to seeking out that information.
And that's probably what separates those who are elite performers from those who are just merely good.
Yeah, I think there's always the age-old argument that talent plays a role too, right? Are you intellectually capable? Are you physically capable? Are you emotionally capable? Are you spiritually capable? And I think that does play a role in specific things, but life is this great bell curve, right? Right, and there's the majority of people who live within the bell curve of that capability. And so if you're in that bell curve and you don't there isn't something that precludes you from advancement, then yeah, it's the willingness to expose yourself to that pain day in and day out, and to recognize that the pain is the purpose, right? That's the pathway. And then, like I'm out in California right now, and my wife just ran her first marathon. She trained in Florida on the flat, and out here the whole thing was hills and elevation gain and loss, and it was 85 degrees when she ran in Florida, and it was when the day she started it was 42 degrees out, never going over 55, and it was rainy and no sun. And so the reality is the operational environment's going to change. You're going to evolve, right, through your age, maturity, wisdom, but the construct of high peak performance doesn't change. It's your willingness to train and train and train, and then the willingness to put yourself on that battlefield and take those big risks.
And I suppose in the world of investing or business, training is less physical and more learning and studying and talking to people who know more than you do and learning from your mistakes and so on.
I don't know, man. I think you look at the science that's out there now and with the Huberman lab, and there's so much science that indicates sleep performance, your intake, what you're putting in your body for your cognitive acuity, right? I mean, sleep, there are more advisors I have met that do not sleep well. And a lot of times, a lot of that has to do with their physical health. So if your physical health is poor, you're not sleeping, that means your cognitive abilities are going to suffer. Certainly your emotional instability heightens. And now all of a sudden, you're under duress and stress. Like that's the core physically. That's where everything begins. So I mean, there's no shortage of fine dining and experiences that are more conducive to comfort in the financial services industry than really putting yourself out on that anvil. And so, but yeah, I think education is massive. But like, what aspects of education? I often ask advisors, how many books about interrogation have you read? How many books about profiling, psychological profiling have you read, or forensic psychology, psychological forensics, right? Or listening courses, or whatever it might be. Much less, understanding the markets at a deep, deep level and being an expert in your field. Because complacency kills for sure. I mean, we would see that quite a bit as guys got older and they became more reticent in their knowledge base and those skill sets, but what changes? Weapon systems change, communications change. Certainly what we've seen in the Ukraine Russia war and the war in Gaza, we've seen a radical shift in what the battlefield looks like. That's going to translate to the next kinetic war our people see. So what are we doing? We're adapting. That training's changed, all the training profiles, where we're training. I mean, they're training in trench warfare again. They're training in drone warfare. They're training in, um, electronic weaponry. So, it really is, if you're sedentary, you're complacent, there are, the way I express it to a lot of teams out there is your enemy, which is your competitor, they're adapting right now. They're training hard.
And my sense is there's an underestimation of the importance of psychology in all of this because there's relationships, you're dealing with people. And so studying how that works from a science standpoint is probably very important as well.
100%. You asked me in the beginning at what being a team guy was about, and is it more physical or psychological? And I mean, obviously, once you once you can do 1,000 push-ups in a day, once you can run a 4 mile time to run on the beach and the prerequisite timing, you're there, right? And other than some type of injury, you keep getting better and better. You get stronger, faster, all that. Well, the same is true with all these other skill sets, right? I mean, it's really about that dedication and what you're trying to accomplish. So I think the psychology of human performance, I mean, obviously that's what I've spent the last 30 years really trying to understand on all these different planes, and I've had this really unique experience of not only within special operations, but, at Blackwater, at the CIA, working, with football teams. And, this year I worked with the Penn State men's hockey team who went to their first final Frozen Four. I worked with, the entire Penn State athletic department and all of their student athletes at the beginning of the year. And I'm learning. I'm like, this year I learned about hockey. And I was like, oh my God, okay, what are the finer points? And, the three or four dialogues I had with, Coach Godusky before I spoke to the team, was essential in teaching what's unique about this particular skill set and this sport, this idea behind hockey. And so it really is a never ending process of understanding, right? Not only your own individual performance metrics and training, but really how it integrates into the battlefield that you're engaged in.
So let's close with two topics that I know you commonly emphasize: purpose and adaptability. Both are very relevant in the world of investing. Obviously, for purpose, you need to know what your North Star is, what direction are you rowing. And then for adaptability, markets are always changing and investing is changing. So you need to be able to adapt. So on purpose, how do you find and maintain a sense of purpose? And why are strong values so important for long term success?
That's the ultimate question right there, right? I mean, dating back thousands of years, who am I and why am I here? I think fundamentally just asking yourselves that question more often. I try and have the individual clients that I work with when I give them their inventory, which is their initial, 3-page questionnaire, the last question is, what's your purpose? And if you're not sure, answer this: who am I? Why am I here? And that will get us going. And I just don't think people do it enough. I ask this question more than any question I ask when I'm giving lectures or speeches or presentations is, all right, what's your purpose? And, the top four answers I get are pretty straightforward. One, my family, be a better father, husband, all that. The other is altruistic in nature. I want to leave the world a better place. I want to have an impact. That whole thing. And then, which is strong to understand because this generation that's coming up, they're much more integrated with altruism than they are within that kind of traditional estimation of purpose and ambition, right? The other is faith based or spirituality. I want to serve God or serve, I want to be a spiritual person. I want to be a good person. And then the final one is I don't know. And I think a lot more people struggle with that than they care to admit. Within your business, I mean, what is your purpose? Your purpose is to provide the absolute best financial advice and service that you can to your clients. Well, that's great. And what is that? And most teams, good teams can write that out. They can show me. All right, here is the profile of how I do that step by step. One, two, three, four. And the more clear that is, the better you are. And that's why I find it fascinating when I ask this question just to the audience or to individuals, like, what's your purpose? They tell me these things. Then I say, well, what is your step by step process? You'd say, I want to be a great father. Okay, well, what does that look like? What does that look like daily? What does that look like, weekly, monthly? Like, how often? You talked about virtue or the other, the morals, or these ideas, like how often do you sit your child down in front of a whiteboard or on a piece of paper with a journal and say, son, or for me, my daughters, I want you to explain to me in detail what you believe integrity means. And then I listen, and then all of a sudden I pull out, the definition. Then I say, all right, this is how I see it. This is how I see it relative to you. This is how you should see it. And I teach that, right? John and I sit down pretty regularly with our kids once a month at least and say, all right, this is what we're not seeing. This is what needs to be adapted. This is what needs to be adjusted. Then do you understand this? No. Okay. Well, let's teach what this is. And so purpose is a derivative of clarity, right? When you know that feeling inside you, but then people feel something, but then they don't place in what we talked about earlier, that real definitive step-by-step process of how to choose it. Now, the other thing that I think is much more frustrating for people, and this is kind of a tough pill to swallow, is that the purpose that you have at 14 is going to be the different than at 24, 34, 44, certainly 54, certainly 64. And, to recognize that, in particular in your industry, people's purpose will change from the moment they come and start working with you till the moment they're retiring and moving into that, philanthropic stage of their lives. And do you really understand what their purpose is? And if you're good, they can come to you with that grand idea and you can help them drill down very specifically on what that is. And by teaching them the expertise you have in the markets, the expertise you have in developing the appropriate portfolio and how to manage the volatility, that's what reinforces and goes back to the ultimate purpose, which is that the relationships that we have in our life are strong, they're fruitful, and they give us the meaning that we ultimately really want to have.
As environments change, whether on the battlefield or in investing, some principles remain constant while others need to adapt. In my experience, the real challenge is knowing where to draw that line. On the investing side, many react to market volatility instead of recognizing that downturns can reveal weaknesses in their core principles. For example, if you're truly well diversified, you don't need to be as reactive. How do you approach staying committed to your core principles while remaining adaptable in other areas?
That's like a two-part question for y'all, right? It's one, and you've been doing this 26 years, and so you've gone through the highs and lows. Whereas, I think there's a lot of people in the industry. What the average age of the advisor right now is 61 years old, right? And half of those advisors will be gone in the next 10 years. What is the other crazy? Something like $35 trillion in wealth is going to change hands from, right, the baby boomers into these next millennials and Gen Zs. And so, are you prepared to deal with that group? Are you prepared to engage them? Do you have the training to bring them on board? Have you actively started to talk to them? Like, we have one of the people that I'm part of this advisor consulting group, and we have some of the best people in the industry on a variety. But this woman on our team, Jackie Wilkie, is like, she does that. She gives you a full script on how to engage your clients on the legacy people, how to keep them apart, how to bring them in. And so now you're talking generational transition for people committed to you. Like, that's a critical understanding and what to do on how to develop that. And then young people coming into the industry, the biggest advice I have for them is go find gentlemen like you and ask them to be your mentor. And they don't have to be your peers or the people you're on the same team with. It can be somebody you met or or someone, whatever, but find those mentors and be educated, because the real world stuff, right? The real world after actions reports, the real world experiences, those who've gone through 87 savings and loan stuff, who went through the dot-com bubble in 2000, or the catastrophic circumstances of 08, 09, right? And then COVID, people who manage that, the wealth of information in those and you all is staggering. So seek them out and learn from that. And that's the other thing, is like, don't allow your pride or your fear to get in the way of going out there and asking for help and getting people that are experienced to teach you and train you what they know.
Oh, Dave, this has been an enlightening conversation. I feel like I learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Alex, so much for having me on. Good luck. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit our website at insightfulinvestor.org to access past shows and learn more about our podcast. If you have questions, feel free to email us at info@insightfulinvestor.org. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to this podcast to ensure you don't miss future episodes. And don't forget to forward today's conversation to others you think would enjoy listening. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Evoke advisors, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed not to make specific trade recommendations, nor reference past or potential profits. And listeners are reminded that securities trading, commodity trading, and alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they are not suitable for all investors. Listeners should be aware that guests featured on The Insightful Investor may have current or past associations with Evoke advisors or the host, including as an investment manager of a private fund opportunity by Evoke, or access through an affiliated Evoke fund, or as a client. Participation as a guest on the podcast should not be perceived as an endorsement or testimonial with respect to Evoke advisors, the podcast host, or their services. Similarly, the inclusion of a guest on the podcast does not imply that Evoke advisors or the host endorses the guest or any company with which they may be affiliated or employed. Evoke has neither paid nor received compensation from guests for their participation.